Dear students, this is a short video on The Language of Paradox by Cleanth Brooks. Brooks is an American teacher and critic. As you all know, he is a new critic, and new critics focus on close reading and structural analysis of literature. His major works are Modern Poetry and the Tradition, published in 1939, and The Well-Wrought Urn, published in 1947. This essay argues the centrality of paradox in poetry. So, what is a paradox? Paradox in poetry means that the tension at the surface of a verse that can lead to apparent contradictions and hypocrisies. It can be interpreted and make sense. In other way around, paradox involves opposite or contradictory ideas, but they are reconciled by poetic imagination. This is an example for paradox in which one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. That's a paradoxic statement because we believe that death is the end of all, but in this poem it is suggested death will die. He begins the essay by discussing certain wrong concepts associated with paradox. For example, paradox is often described as the language of sophistry, hard, bright, and witty. As a result, it is not considered as a language of the soul or emotion. But according to Brooks, paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry, and he demonstrated in the rest of the essay. He comments that because of the inferior position given to paradox, often it is used in epigram and satire, and paradox is often considered as intellectual rather than emotional, clever rather than profound, rational rather than divinely rational. As a result, the true nature of paradox is often not discussed. In this essay, he argues for the centrality of the language of paradox in poetry and says that only scientific use of language requires a language without any trace of paradox. In order to substantiate his argument, he quotes from William Wordsworth. He comments that Wordsworth doesn't provide so many instances of paradox, and he also insists on simplicity and distrusts sophistry. As a result, Wordsworth doesn't make elaborate use of paradox, but he says that some of the best poems written by Wordsworth is produced also out of paradoxical situations. Brooks quotes from Wordsworth's poem titled "It's a Beauteous Evening," in which he described the evening sky as calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. There is paradox in the use of in the adjectives used. For example, quiet and calm is in contrast to breathless, which stand for excitement. In the poem, the poet is looking at the evening sky and it fills him devotion. On the other hand, a girl who is walking by him is not at all moved by it. The paradox emerges when the poet says that the girl is more devotional than him, even though she is not moved by the evening sky. He elaborates that his devotion is temporary and sporadic. On the other hand, the girl has deep sympathy for all forms of nature throughout the year. So the girl's devotion is unconscious, whereas the poet's is deliberate. So the initial and surface conflict, which is that the speaker is filled with worship while his female companion is not, triggers further discussions, and the paradox is revealed when the girl is more full of worship than the speaker because she is always consumed with the sympathy for nature, where the poet's devotion is temporary and sporadic. Brooks relates this to the comment made by William Wordsworth in his preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, where he says that his general purpose was to choose incidents and situations from common life, but so to treat them that ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual way. So paradox help poets to present ordinary things in unusual way. In short, Wordsworth was attempting to show his audience that the common was really uncommon, the prosaic was really poetic. Romantic writers employ paradox in order to invoke wonder and surprise. In the next section of the essay, Brooks quotes another poem by Wordsworth titled Composed upon Westminster Bridge. In this poem, the paradox comes not from its details, but in the situation which the speaker creates. In this poem, the poet records his impression of the city of London in the early morning. The poet is able to appreciate the morning beauty of the city. This is in contrast to the romantic description of city as inanimate and mechanical. But looking at the city in the morning, the poet is able to relate the man-made marvel, that is the city, to organic life, because it is a product of human beings and human beings are part of the organic world. In that way, this poem is able to connect a city as an organic world, which is a paradoxical situation, because cities are in romantic literature looked down as inanimate and mechanical. Brooks then quotes a few lines from Alexander Pope and suggests that neoclassical writers also make use of paradox, and by employing paradox, they invoke irony. In neoclassical poetry, paradox insists on irony. On the other hand, in romantic literature, it invokes surprise and wonder. There is a certain avid wonder in Pope, just as there is certain trace of irony implicit in Wordsworth's sonnets. In other way round, these two, wonder and irony, often merge into one. Wonder and irony merge in many ways of the lyrics of Blake. They merge in Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. In that sense, even though romantic writers use paradox to evoke wonder and neoclassical writers use it to evoke irony, often they happen in a blend, which means both irony and wonder happen in the same context. In this example, it is very clear that the paradoxes form the very nature of poet's language. It's a language in which connotation play as great a part as the denotation. In this section, Brooks describes language of paradox as perpetual. It cannot be kept out of the poem. It can only be directed and controlled. So by citing examples from Wordsworth, Alexander Pope, and also taking a look at the poems of William Blake, he says that language of paradox cannot be kept out of poetry. Scientific use of language stabilizes terms and frees them into strict denotations. So in scientific use, words are not allowed to imply denotative meanings. They are fixed and stabilized. But in poetic usage, in poetic language, denotations play a very significant role. The poets work with comparisons. Metaphors never fit smoothly to one another. They always upset the directness of ideas. There is a continuous change of context and meaning. They overlap and contradict. So this is a common feature of poetic language or language of paradox, that metaphors do not have a smooth linear line of meaning, but on the other hand, metaphors always mismatch, overlap, contradict, and through this, poetry is able to produce a very different meaning. In order to make these arguments clearer, Brooks delves into a detailed analysis of Canonization, a poem by Donne who is a metaphysical writer. In this part, Brooks analyzes the way paradox functions in canonization. He says that the poet daringly treats profane love as if it were divine love. It combines love and religion, pairing unlike circumstances and produce complex meaning. In other way around, in canonization, Donne is comparing unlikely things. For example, on one part there is religion, on the other part there is love. One is supposed to be spiritual and the other is supposed to be material, physical. But these two opposite, contradictory ideas are treated in canonization. That's why Brooks says it is an example for paradox. The conflict between the real world and the lover absorbed in the world of love runs through the poem. It dominates the second stanza, in which the torments of love, so vivid to the lover, does not affect the real world. The lover's case is highly paradoxic. In fact, they have rejected the practical world, and by renouncing the practical world, they have gained the most intense life. This paradox has been hinted at earlier in the phoenix metaphor, where a phoenix bird dies to be born. Similarly, the lovers have rejected the actual world, the physical world, the practical world, but they have gained most intense life. Donne's use of the word die also invoke paradox. For example, in 16th and 17th century, die refers to consummation of the act of love, which means that go for the physical intercourse. At the same time, die also means end of life. Similarly, there is a conflict between singleness and duality. For example, the lovers are two, but they are in fact being one. Brooks argues that these complexities of life can only be narrated in paradox. He quotes Coleridge's observation on imagination and says that imagination reconciles the opposites such as sameness with difference, general with concrete, idea with image, individual with representation. All these are features of paradox. Brooks concludes by stating that the urn which the ash of the lovers kept is the poem itself, and like the phoenix, it will rise from it. He also persuades his readers to be prepared to accept the paradox of imagination. Thank you.